Today I'll be talking to Sudipta Mondal, a Bangalore-based investigative journalist who reports on caste, communalism, and corruption, and has written for publications around the world. He's also currently working on a book on the history of Ambedkar Students Association and the Dalit resurgence triggered by the death of Rohit Vemula. Thank you, Sudipta, for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. So when we were growing up in our neighborhoods, it was, to start with, it was cinema music when I was really young. Around about the 90s, hip hop entered. Okay. And hip hop entered into these neighborhoods also because of the simple fact that the skin color matched, when you talk about 50 Cent or Snoop Dogg, there were actually guys in our neighborhoods who looked like that, and they're like, wow, these guys are on screen and all that. So hip hop came to our neighborhoods quite organically, okay. Then after that, hip hop, all those loose clothes, crazy bling and all that has to do, okay, till around 24-ish. And then I went into Asian College of Journalism, where all these JNU types and all that come, and rock, and they're having, so flower power happened in the West in the 70s.
Yeah.
Okay. Flower power started happening in India in, let's say, the 80s or the 90s, right? So in terms of like upper crest culture.
Yeah.
Okay. So in ACJ, you had people talking about Foucault, Derrida, Marx, all of this stuff. And I was like, okay, what is all this? And the other thing was Bob Dylan and, blowing
the
and
anti-war.
all that, okay? And for me, I was embarrassed about the fact that I was a hip hop fan, not knowing the revolutionary potential of the music that I grew up with, literally. I would just be like, no, rock and, the left and P. Sainath, and all that shit.
The Holy Trinity. Rock, left, and P. Sainath. That's a great article title.
Absolutely. So rock, left, and P. Sainath kind of became my thing, and that was a complete pretense, okay? Like for a few years, I had to do that because I worked in the Hindu, okay, where all these Bob Dylan fans and Enram fans would be there, okay? So, it's only after Rohit Vemula that I kind of rediscovered pride in my own people, in my own culture. I didn't have to pretend anymore because I was no longer in the Hindu. So I didn't have to pretend to be comrade. I could really, wear my Ambedkar on my sleeve. As a reporter, you do work with the premise that the state is an actor that needs to be held responsible, and all the arms of the state. I like to call upper crest, upper class people Maida, okay? So all the Maida kids had to learn it through Marx, through the language of human rights, through this thing. For me, it was like, at the age of 15, I was in a police lockup, okay? So for me, it was already condensed in my heart that jab chance milega, main thulle ka ukhadunga main, okay? So for me, it was like something which was natural. I didn't have to learn human rights to hate the police. It is because of P. Sainath and Kancha Elaya that I became a journalist. Okay. When P. Sainath started talking about the things he did to get his stories, the first thing that I felt was, man, I can do that. Okay. Because it is about talking to people, right? I'm the people. Sainath has to learn how to talk to people. I mean, with due respect to him, I am the people. I know how to talk to people. He didn't grow up in the slums. So, for me, that was the moment when he was talking itself, I was like, man, this is something I can do. Okay. Going to the field. I have strong legs. I played football. Just the simple mechanics of journalism, right? The body mechanics of journalism, which is carrying a sack, walking 10 kilometers, taking those shots, coming back, filing the story the same day, right? Now, that is for me decathlon, okay? Journalism is like sport for me from day one, because it is like, man, you have to do all those things. You have to do running also, you have to do writing also, you have to do thinking also, all in one day. And the story has to be in by 4 o'clock. So when Sainath was talking and everyone's going, wow, and all that, he went to all these difficult places and all that. I'm like, I also grown up in difficult places. It's difficult places I can go to. So that confidence for me was very quiet at that point. Now I'm crowing about it. Okay. Back in 2006 and all of that, I was like quietly confident that I can pull this off. Okay. And I knew that I wanted to be that kind of reporter. Which kind of reporter? Sainath kind of reporter. So he really managed to inspire us, in terms of what a field reporter is like. But the question is, do I want to have Sainath's gaze? And for me, the answer came immediately a few sessions later in the same Asian College of Journalism when Kancha Elaya came for a lecture. And he told us why he's not a Hindu. And that's when I realized, Arey, I am that only, you know. Because see, the thing is, in a place like Bangalore, right? I mean, it's a largely apolitical space. My family identifies more as Christian than as Dalit. You know, the name Mandal means nothing in South India. It means everything in Bengal, right? So when I went to the Asian college, there were a lot of our Banerjee, Mukherjee, that crowd was there, and very quickly I realized who I was, you know, because as a Christian you don't have an SC certificate, right? All of these things. So for me, I realized that I need to be that hardcore field reporter like Sainath, and have Professor Ailea's critical gaze.
From ACJ, you land up at the Hindu. Is that accurate?
I landed up at the Hindu, okay, because Sainath was my hero at that point. I wanted to be a rural reporter. Okay, I did not know that Sainath never lived I was never posted in a rural area. It's to go from, a lot of these journalists who've done reporting on rural areas would paratroop down. They would live in a Bombay or a Delhi or whatever. Okay, and every now and then, because they're working for Frontline or something like that, or they would go on these what do you call them, expeditions, no? So stock up on food, on mosquito repellent, on all of that, and then go out into the boondocks, because you have to come back with a great story. So after my degree at the Asian College, I was hoping that something like that would happen to me, because I thought all you have to be is enthusiastic. Somebody will keep sending me into the rural areas. Very quickly, I realized that's not going to happen. So by the time the Hindu people asked me, what do you want to do? I said, I want to work in a district. Because I realized that nobody is going to send me off to the district with a fat allowance. So they sent me to a district. Okay, and that's where I cut my teeth. Okay, I suddenly realized that I was this guy who had an insider-outsider experience there. Right? Insider, why? Because the persecuted communities are my kind of communities. Right? Dalits, Muslims, Christians. So there is an insider experience there while talking to those communities, while interacting with those communities, while understanding their persecution. There's a certain insider experience. And the outsider experience is that I'm not from Mangalore. I'm not a local journalist with connections to local politicians and local cops and all of that. So I became the the disrupting force in that region. Because what started happening is I work for the Hindu. Okay, all these. So I was one of the first persons to start writing about these vigilante attacks that would happen on boys and girls, and love jihad and all that. Love jihad started in Mangalore. That terminology was coined in Mangalore. Love jihad. So what would happen is 9 o'clock in the morning, 9:30 in the morning, everyone's going to office and college and school and all that. Suddenly I'll get a tip off saying that there's been an attack. What happened? You go, you find out that in some place, the bus has been stopped by a mob and a girl and boy have been dragged out and they've been smacked around. Then you ask the other reporters, they'll be like, ladka ladki case. I said, okay, ladka ladki case, what, why, but mara kyun aise karke? Nahi, wo ladka ladki case. For families only send the gundas. Within 2 days, I found out that was not the case, and that these were Bajrang Dal people who were beating up the girl and the boy because the girl was Hindu and the boy was a Muslim. So the immediate question is, why were the cops not getting involved? And then I discovered the other thing, which is that after the beating, the girl and boy would be taken to the police station, and there's a complaints register in which, for public indecency, there would be a non-cognizable offense in the station register, which does not turn into an FIR. That is my first big story. Okay, I went all over the 3 districts, police station to police station to police station, land up over there, pretend like I'm a Sanghi. Sir, I believe girls and boys are going crazy nowadays. Everywhere they're getting caught because of all these things. There's something happening, and I believe there is a conspiracy from Pakistan to court the affections of Indian women. Yeah, there is this entry in our register. Show me, sir. Show me that register, sir. Yes, the register opens, and sure enough, Rekha and Abdullah, were traveling in a bus. Okay, and then concerned citizens, and brought them. So that's shit. So that is my first big story, and everyone in the district, including my colleagues in the Hindu, got really angry. You realize also that a cow attack written by somebody who's a big name in the Hindu would get national page coverage. Me putting my life on the line on my two-wheeler, landing up at the spot of a riot, taking the photographs, critical photographs, coming back, filing the story, living off the ground, living there, not paratrooping and going back to base. Yeah. I have to live in coastal Karnataka. I was not getting those national page stories. Why? Because there's a bureaucracy involved in the Hindu, in which there are equals and there are some people who are more equal, right? There are secular stories, so-called secular stories, and then there are stories which are very secular. So they need to be on front page because they're very secular. Why? Because the person who's written it is Enram's blue-eyed boy. So those are very highly secular stories. So my stories are secular, but not so secular because I don't have that cross belt, no, or I don't have that fair skin, or I don't have that Sharma next to my name, or Sethi next to my name, you know. So my stories kept getting buried in the local pages. So when these international publications started coming, right, to me, saying, can you give me a contact of this person? You wrote this story in which you interviewed one victim of a vigilante attack. Can you give that number? Can you take us there? And all that. I said, yeah, of course I can take you there. So I would take these people for free, you know. And then once one BBC reporter said, hey, we'll make it worth your while. And back then I was very proud. No, I was working for Enram. I was working for Hindu. I had all that pride. I said, I get my salary. What salary? 11,000 rupees. Until the day I overheard one of these foreign reporters talking to somebody back in the bureau, referring to me as a fixer. Okay. And I'm like, man, I'm the subject expert over here. You know, I'm taking you around, putting my life on the line. You will fly back to New York after the story is done. I'm still going to live in Mangalore. And what word did you use for me? Fixer. You know, I was livid, you know. I just lost my cool. I said, who came up with this term here? Fixer, you know. I can be your local source. I can be this thing. But then I realized to these people, we are just a bunch of eyes and ears, yeah. You know, for all these big reporters who come from Delhi, New York, London, all these places, they will go back and get their awards, okay? We district reporters would provide them their primary data, their primary research. We would give them the right perspective. At the end, we would get called fixer and they would be called award-winning journalist. So for me, this kind of thing was becoming very frustrating. You know, there would be days, and understand that I'm an urban guy working in a rural area.
Right.
I'm used to hip hop and parties and weed. I'm used to rave parties and that kind of thing. I'm living the life of a hermit over there. Okay. On a salary of 11,000 rupees. When I was in event management, I was an advertising copywriter and all those things before my previous life. In one event, to MC one event, I would get 40,000 rupees back in 2003, 4 and all that. Right. And suddenly I was down to living this poor life. And you start wondering, because you're alone in the district and you have lots of thoughts, you have only your thoughts and you have your sources, right? And you wonder, man, how this is a hole I've dug myself into. When they said go to Calcutta, Bombay, vagera, you didn't go. Okay. And then I discovered that my non-Brahmin, non-elite friends who have gone to Calcutta, Bombay, they also got jacked. Right? Kartikeyan Damodaran and Chitti Babu. Chitti Babu went to Chennai. He took on the desk. He was a very smart guy. He was harassed over there. He had to quit. Kartikeyan Damodaran also joined the Hindu. He was also, you know, he was harassed. He raised an issue with Enram. Some of those issues were addressed. You know, they started referring to Kartikeyan Damodaran as, hey man, that Dalit story is there. Why don't you go? Then you realize, oh shit, something, you know, the demoralizing, that crushing feeling I started getting in the district, right? I had already been attacked thrice. There were 3 attempts on my life in Mangalore because of the kind of reporting I was doing. Right. And for me, it became, how the hell do I get out of this hole? Nobody's promoting me. When I call up Parvati Menon, the chief of bureau, the great comrade, friend of Enram, and I say, can I get an increment? Can I get a promotion? Okay, I don't want any of those things. Can you stop these Sanghi people who put roadblocks in my way every time I want to go for a story? Can you provide me at least some protection from the harassment I get at the hands of these Sanghis? That also the comrade Ram's coterie and all that, they couldn't provide. Okay. On the day when I'm covering the church attacks, okay, in Mangalore, in 2008, September, there were the church attacks. On the same day, my local bureau chief, local boss, not the bureau chief, the local fellow who was in charge that day, who was a Sanghi, was also making me do train timings.
Are the two other reporters you mentioned, Chitti Babu and Karthikeyan, are they still in journalism? I'm just curious
No,
if
no,
no.
they were smarter than me. They were smarter than me. They left for academia.
I think if we can, moving on from your experiences in places like Hindu and Hindustan Times, there's also this this debate over if it makes more sense for Dalits and for Dalit reporters in mainstream media either to kind of occupy more central space in the reporting and have greater role, or to kind of completely kind of ignore the mainstream media and the kind of work they do and have alternative media platforms, and there are quite a few of those. Like what's your position on that debate?
The experiments that have happened in the anti-caste media space, a lot of people in our industry would dismiss it as activist media. I don't know what is activist media. When Enram goes to Tibet and comes back with a story which is glowing, is it activist media or is it professional media? I don't know. When he says he loves Rajapaksa, is it activist media or professional media? I don't know. When Shekhar Gupta says attack China, okay, or whatever, is he doing activist media? The question really in journalism is who is doing the activism? All so-called great editors in the history of Indian journalism have done their share of activism. Goenka stood against the emergency. Enram did Bofors. So that is not activism supposedly. But what Dalit Camera does, or Vellivara does, or Ambedkar's Caravan does, or Roundtable India does, is supposedly activism. Okay. So therefore, I do not believe that believe in this category or this ghetto inside which Indian mainstream journalists have put publications such as the Roundtable India and that bouquet of publications.
Yeah.
Right. If you look at how the presence of African Americans has grown in American media, right? Post the 1960s, the race riots happened. The Kerner Commission gets set up. In '73, the American Society of Newspaper Editors, they passed that resolution. Two things start happening as a result of that. One, you see the emergence of the black press. And it will be wrong for me to say that the black press emerged in that context, because the black press has been there, is as old as the Underground Railroad. Because there are people who I met in the US on my visits there who made me appreciative of the fact that what we call newspapers need not be this many inches and have this many columns. A paper which carries the news is a newspaper, So the black press, in that sense, is as old as the Underground Railroad in the US. Okay, but nevertheless, if you look at what some people such as Kenneth Cooper, I met him when I was in Harvard. I met Cooper, and he was talking about how this acceptance of this fracture or this fault line in American journalism in 1973 resulted in a twofold process. One, a lot of African American, Hispanic, and other minority journalists, people from other minorities, became journalists in the New York Times, Washington Post, all of that. But what also happened is a lot of black-owned publications became the rate of becoming quote-unquote professional was gathered pace after that in the 70s is what they say. So now if you look at the African American presence in the media, they have threefold presence, right? They have what you would call the so-called black press, which is today the most powerful anti-establishment press in the world. If they make up their minds, they can make all the newspapers in the world stand up and take note. That is how powerful the black press today is, despite being so-called alternate. Mm-hmm. Right. In addition to that, there are enough and more black reporters in these big publications. And the third most important thing is the third arm of what we call the media. Right? Media is not only journalism. Entertainment is a very big part of media. In the entire sports and entertainment segment, they have a huge presence. So their journey, our journey, is very, very different. It is not an either or question. It is an and. It's a this plus this plus this plus this plus this kind of a question. Which means yes, we need Paranjit. Yes, we need Jyoti Nisha. Shout out to her. Yes, we need people such as Priyadarshini, who's another filmmaker in Chennai. We need people such as Paranjit, Nagaraj Manjulita, I've already mentioned. We do need people such as Sumit Samos, who is a rapper. My brother Kiran, who's another rapper in the Hyderabad University. We need people in the in the space of writing books also, right? If you look at Sujata Gidla, if you look at Yashika Dutt, if you look at Suraj Engde, they represent, all of their books have been coincidentally very controversial within the Ambedkarite circles. And for me, that is a great ray of hope. It shows that we are a diverse movement which has several critical positions, which may be at odds with other critical positions in the same space. So Sharmin Hossain, okay, she's somebody who is expanding the framework of what we understand to be caste as an endemic problem in India. She's from Bangladesh. Right? So she's expanding the understanding of the anti-caste struggle and the anti-caste lens in those spaces. There is Huma Dar. Right? Huma Dar is somebody who is an anti-caste scholar, who's also a Kashmiri ideologue. She's looking at the intersection of caste and anti-colonialism. Right? All of India is basically colonized by Delhi. Right? Now that articulation has come from previous groups of scholars who from the left tradition.
Right.
Now, there's a very critical improvement of that understanding that has happened as a result of the anti-caste movement, and that improvement happens to be the coinage of the term Brahminical colonialism or Brahmin colonialism. Right? That this is not Delhi colonialism. This is not just Hindi colonialism. This is not just the colonialism of the Anglophones. Mm-hmm. This is of a different kind. This is a caste colonialism. So how do we have this understanding today? It is because of the fact that our discourse is international. Our discourse has meshed with other discourses which bear resemblance to our thoughts and ideas. Right? So many of the things that Ambedkar had left undone are getting done now in the scholar space. We have contributed some very important critical theory in the space of in the progressive space.
We know that a lot of liberal academia, social scientists, like there is a kind of, or journalists, or in liberal, kind of ideology in general. Sometimes there's a blinder to the caste question because they themselves feel that because we do not participate ideologically in this thing, that we're kind of out of it and we don't have to interrogate our own positions. And conversely, within certain right-wing movements in India, you see that they've deployed the idea of caste and hierarchy and social groups in a much more, for them, effective way. I think, some groups like the Bajrang Dal, for example, there's they probably have recognized that as a political strategy, right? Do you feel in some cases that the right or the Hindu right has managed to make great gains out of this, and which the left and the liberals might have missed out on?
See, this Hindu right business, no, I call it the Hindu modernity movement, right? Savarkar, what he brought about among Hindus is modernity, right? Saying that we are a modern political movement which has to shed caste, okay, which has to shed blind beliefs. I see that Hindus are so serious about a certain kind of modernity, which you would probably see in a Saas Bahu serial, right? That the wife is educated, but she's sitting at home. Yeah. Okay, she knows mathematics also. Tulsi can solve some equation also. She can solve some kitchen disaster also, and she can solve kitchen politics also. Okay, this is a result of the movement towards Hindu modernity, towards which I think a lot of people have contributed in addition to Savarkar. So this is a process of building a congregation. You call it Bajrang Dal today. Okay, this concept of building a congregation to build a Hindu identity started with the Adi Shankara, right, who went all the way to Kailasa and staked his claim on on a region of the earth which both the Jains and the Buddhists found considered holy. He put a Hindu stake also over there. What did he also do? His time is also the time when monastic orders within Hinduism start taking shape. as a copycat of Buddhism. Right? Because Buddha talks about Sangham. Buddha talks about Sangha. Sangh, the parivar that they talk about, where do they get that concept of Sangh in a religion which does not believe in Sangh? This is a religion and this is a community, this is a people who do not believe in global humanism, in universalism. How then have they modernized themselves to a point where they have a formation like the RSS and Bajrang Dal? The need for the Sangha grew even as other races and civilizations in the world were working on the same concept, right? The Chinese were already working on the concept of the Chinese race and the Chinese civilization, right? The Mongols, in terms of racial pride, what the Mongols achieved is phenomenal. Okay, what they managed to create in terms of a secular polity. So I feel that the modernity thing comes from a deep-seated sense of guilt also. No Sangh Parivar fellow, very few Sangh Parivar fellows will say that yes, man, caste system is good, untouchability is good. They'll say all Hindus unite. Theirs is a imperial program. That of the left is a colonial program. That is why the Sangh is so keen to be inclusive towards us. Because if we, in one voice, call out for another nation, this whole nation will collapse, no?
I think the nice way to round this up is to talk about Jogendranath Mandal and his, tragic but also quite, illuminating political career. If you can just
Jogendranath Mandal, you will be surprised. Okay, this is giving me goosebumps. Okay, so obviously because he's also my namesake, because my family history is connected to his movement. My grandfather ran away from Mirpur in Bangladesh and came to Madanapalli in Chittoor district of Andhra Pradesh. Okay, that's a story in itself. But Jogendranath Mandal is a very special character for me. Okay, and the reason I got goosebumps is not because of that. I'm not so senti and all that. But the reason I got goosebumps is because I remembered the people who are now working in his name in Bengal. So Jogendranath Mandal was a forgotten figure, right? He came back to India as a broken man because he discovered what the mullah is capable of. That the mullah is no less Brahminical than the pujari, right? We talk about Brahminism as something of a COVID kind of disease, right? Anybody can get it. He experienced the Brahminism of Liaquat Ali Khan, right? There's a rumored conversation. I don't know if it's a real conversation or a rumored conversation or it's part of legend. Sometimes, it is, as a reporter, and I hope you will agree, legend is so much part of political culture that you don't, after a point, bother about whether was it true or was it not true, right? If it is so popular among people that it keeps coming up in conversation, then at least that story has certain political potential, right? What is that story? That story is of Ambedkar supposedly telling Liaquat Ali Khan that, man, you guys had promised that you will implement social justice measures in Pakistan. What happened we have implemented reservations for Dalits and Adivasis in India. What about Pakistan? If you can't provide affirmative action, you send them to India. We will take care of them. So Liaquat Ali Khan supposedly says, if we send them back, who will clean the toilets in Lahore and Karachi? So that is a story. You will be surprised. After Rohit Vemla, I traveled across India, right? I met many India, and I went to the US. I went to other parts of the world where I met with Ambedkarite Dalits and all of that. This story is so popular. A lot of people talk about this story. Whether it is true or not, I don't care. It is a fact, nevertheless, that whether it is Bangladesh or in Pakistan, okay, Dalits are worse off than they are in India. Okay, because there is no institutional measure to address the question of their subordination. Jogendranath Mandal what he was, what he stands for, what he stood for, is all in the public domain. People should read him up. As a reporter, I can tell you what happened because of Jogendranath's absence from the political landscape in Bangladesh. Today, we have millions of Bangladeshi labor providing slave labor to the whole of the world. They are pretty much cleaning toilets around the world. They are providing sexual labor and conservancy labor. The dirtiest of the dirty work across the world today is being performed by that Bangladeshi Namashudro, who became tetherless, anchorless, with Jogendranath Mondal returning to India as a heartbroken man who was betrayed by the Pakistani mullah establishment, the Pakistani upper caste Sayyid Ashraf establishment. Right? Today, their lives are in danger. Their lives are in danger, in greater danger than Dalit lives are in India. This I can say as a reporter. Why? Because millions of Bangladeshi lower caste people are across India performing the same duty that Dalits have been performing for thousands of years. So post 90s, what happens in India? There's a boom, there's a finance market boom. That money is invested in real estate, which is another speculative industry. But nevertheless, money is invested in real estate. That results in that adds pace to the rural-urban migration, because the road builders, the building builders are all most often lower caste workers from rural India. Now, that created a vacuum in the agricultural sector because the agricultural labor vanished to the cities. These were Dalits who were doing either agricultural labor or conservancy work. Now, they moved on to construction labor. The conservancy work also in the cities, many Dalit communities moved to construction labor. And the conservancy work was taken up by Bangladeshis. And this is true of the whole of India, brother. Delhi, Bombay, Calcutta, Chennai, Bangalore, Hyderabad, wherever there is garbage work, it is being done by two communities of people, Rohingya and Bangladeshi. And then the third category in that is, to a much lesser extent, Bengali Muslims from Malda, Murshidabad, Krishnanagar, all these parts. Krishnanagar is in Bangladesh or India? I don't know. Whatever, those border regions. Okay. The Dalit Muslims from there are coming into mainland India. What happened to my people? Look at my grandfather. He was not a Hindu or a Muslim. He was a Christian. Why did he have to leave that part of Bengal, literally run away with his life, okay, and come to Madanapalli in Chittoor? There's an entire story around this thing. So the absence of Jogendranath Mondal from the political landscape of Bengal as a person who could push that polemical separatist line in Bengal. Do not forget that it is because of Jogendranath Mondal today that the Dalit movement even exists in its shape and form. Because had Ambedkar not entered had not been elected from Bengal because of the efforts of Mondal, we would not have had an Ambedkarite movement.
Well, I think we need to bring this to an end. And but thanks a lot for this really wide-ranging chat, and thanks again for being part of this conversation.